be a single, cohesive society.
A single culture?
A culture which will change, because that's the thing that I think you get wrong. I think the proponents of active multiculturalism fear that everyone who comes to this country from outside is going to be forced into a straitjacket of what already exists, and that isn't how it works. The point is the culture changes. We are a different culture. We have evolved because of the immigration. And that's been a positive thing. I think we are very diverse. It's a very vibrant culture. And I think Britain is a very exciting place.
It's multicultural.
No, it isn't multicultural. I think,
What is it we should...
It isn't it's a culture which has evolved, a single culture which has evolved and become richer. But the point David was making, which is absolutely right, is that positive, proactive multiculturalism is the enemy of a cohesive society. It promotes separatism, and we don't want to have that separatism. We want to have a cohesive, unified society.
The woman in the front here, and then I go to the woman up there. Yes.
So why are we, is your government promoting free schools? 4 out of the 9 free schools are church schools.
Okay. And they don't get... the woman there?
Isn't part of the problem with the terminology? Don't we really want to call it omniculturalism?
Right. Ming Campbell, do you want to call it what do you make of what it... Look,
well, I was in Munich. I heard the speech.
You were there?
I was there. I heard the speech. It was at a conference on security. Most of the time was spent talking about the transatlantic relationship and how we dealt with the issue of nuclear weapons and how we dealt with the issue of Afghanistan. And then up popped the Prime Minister and made this speech, which seemed to me, perhaps, to be better designed for a domestic occasion than an international one. But the point which I think is important, and it really goes to this question of forced marriage and other things of that kind, I really hark back to what I said in relation to the first question. The rule of law is the rule of law. And if any girl is being married contrary to the legislation or the common law of this country, then it doesn't matter from which part of the community she comes, that law should be enforced. And there should be no question of holding back simply because, in some circumstances, certain cultures approach the matter in a different way.
Are you saying people, the police and the authorities do hold back because of cultural reasons?
Well, there has been
prosecuting people for breaking the law.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there has been some suggestion in the past that the authorities have not been all that diligent in trying to find young women, for example, who've been taken out of this country. But now they are. Now there are units that do that, and from time to time you'll read stories of people who've been successfully brought back. Part of the problem is that there is no one definition of multiculturalism. Exactly. No one has actually sat down and tried to define it in a way that would be universally acceptable. But let me suggest 2 things to you. First of all, we're a multicultural country. Why? Because of Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales. And you'll find that on Saturday afternoon at Murrayfield. We have our identity, but look, there are Scotsmen and Welshmen and women all serving in the British Army. So it's perfectly possible to have an affinity of the kind I've described and also to have a loyalty. And the other point I want to make is this. I think multiculturalism ought to be about celebrating Eid, Diwali, Hanukkah and Christmas. We should not find ourselves driven into circumstances in which schools wonder whether or not they can have a Christmas tree and ask Father Christmas to come along half a dozen days before Christmas.
I've been very lucky. I've lived and worked all over the world, and Britain is by far the most tolerant society I've ever come across. However, what I'm concerned about is that, I think Douglas was right, what seems to happen is when something is said, there are minority groups of growing vocal ability who will find offence in whatever you say and find a channel to get that offence shouted about. And that, I think, is part of the problem we've got now. But the bottom line is we are an incredibly tolerant society, and we should be very, very proud of that.
Jacqui Smith, the Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary, Sadiq Khan, said Cameron was writing propaganda for the English Defence League. Do you agree with him?
Well, what I think was most unhelpful about this speech, actually, was the spin around it. When I went back and actually read the speech itself, I actually agreed with the major thrust of the argument, which it seemed to me was, firstly, that in order to tackle terrorism, we need to tackle radicalisation and violent extremism. That secondly, there is a fundamental difference between Islam and Islamic extremism. But that thirdly, even if extremism is non-violent, it nevertheless can create a space within which violence may well flourish, and we need to challenge that non-violent extremism by a positive assertion and promotion of shared British values. Now, but what I found much more difficult about the speech was, first of all, and others have mentioned it, a sort of caricature of history that, with this idea of state multiculturalism, which I've never seen and which I think was just setting up some sort of something for him to shoot down. And secondly, I do think it was unfortunate that when he was talking about shared British values on the day when the English Defence League were marching through Luton, he didn't also link those a programme of violent extremism to precisely the sort of right-wing violent extremists who were acting within Britain at that particular time, and who also we should be challenging with our shared British values, and who have more in common with Islamist extremists than they do with the mainstream Muslim community in this country. So I agreed with the fundamental argument, but I think the spin around it and the idea of actually setting up something to argue against, when actually this was the argument that I included in the previous government's public counter-terror strategy, I think was slightly dishonest.
Douglas Murray, do you want to come back on what Mehdi Hasan said?
Well, look, I mean, both of the left-wing people on the panel tonight, Mehdi and Jacqui Smith, if you can still call Labour members left-wing, but both of them have done the same thing the left always does on this. You try to have a discussion about the failure of multiculturalism, and you have the BNP thrown in by Mehdi. Told, well, the BNP member congratulated him, at least concede, Mehdi, all sorts of crazy and horrible and disgusting people can jump on a bandwagon without meaning that it's the wrong thing to have said. Maybe they're just opportunists. I suspect they are. And Jacqui then throws in the example of the EDL. And thinks, do you really think, Jacqui, that was what David Cameron was aiming to do? I mean, a couple of, 100 people marching in Luton does not mean the Prime Minister of Britain should not be making a speech about a very serious matter. And this is the problem. The debate by the left is always attempted to be shut down by associating it with far-right extremist and racist groups instead of having a frank and honest discussion.
I did not say that he shouldn't make the speech. And I said I thought the argument he made in the speech was right, and incidentally, it was the one that we had previously made. What I said was it would have been appropriate, given that speech, to also say that when we're promoting shared British values against Islamist extremism, we should also do it against right-wing extremism.
I think you can belittle the idea of a couple of hundred extremists, but if you put yourself in the shoes of a British Muslim in Luton or in other cities where the EDL have marched, who live in fear of those groups, then I think they have a right for their Prime Minister not to go abroad to Germany and send them lectures from there on who isn't and isn't an extremist.
Take a couple of points from our audience, and then we'll go on to another question. The gentleman there, you say. Yes. Yes?
Actually, I was thinking David Cameron don't have any other bad news ready for the last week, so he just said that. And, can you elaborate what we have to wear, what we have to celebrate, and how we have to celebrate and condole? So, I mean, we can give up our multicultural expression, how we can express our values?
Okay, and you, sir?
I agree with the gentleman who just said that Britain is a very tolerant society. Yes, it is very true. It's a very, very tolerant society. Sadly, the tolerance of this country has been abused by certain religious groups. And I completely agree with Douglas Murray when he said that Mr. Cameron has done the right thing. And I hope Mr. Cameron means business. Now, Mr. Cameron was making this speech in the context of terrorism. And what he was trying to convey a message was how we target terrorism. Unfortunately, this country in the last 15 years has not addressed the root cause of terrorism. The root cause of terrorism is bad teaching in religious schools. And that has to be addressed fundamentally.
It's rubbish.
You're saying rubbish?
Rubbish. Very briefly, we didn't get into this, but one of my other objections to David Cameron's speech is the idea, you want to give a speech on multiculturalism, give a speech on multiculturalism. You want to give a speech on counter-terrorism, give a speech on counter-terrorism. Don't pretend they're one and the same thing. Don't offend our intelligence. Terrorism is not a cultural problem. Terrorism is a political problem.
No, and it's a religious problem as well. And it's a religious problem
in your
as well.
view, Douglas.
No, in the view of a lot of people, including the people who carry out acts of terror, who say they do it in the name of religion.
They also